Take it away.
Okay, you are live on the mixer.
Okay, I think we'll get started. We'd like to welcome you. This is Dan Mills, and I am the vice chair and tonight acting chair of the Planning Commission. And this is the work meeting for the Cottonwood Heights Planning Commission, April 6, 2022. And should we review the agenda first? We have before us Project ZTA-19-001, Sensitive Lands Evaluation and Development Standards, or Sleds for short. And we'll point out for those that are listening that we do have a quorum to conduct business, and we don't have to worry about ex parte or conflict of interest in this setting, correct? That comes in our.
There's no vote. No
decisions.
No decisions.
Yeah.
So, and then following this, we'll have our business meeting after our work is completed here. So
Tonight we're going until 6:30, right?
yeah.
Yes, plan is to have a work session till 6:30, and then we'll convene in the business session. We just have the one item on for this.
Great.
Would you like staff to start with a review of the business meeting item? And then-
Yes, let's get some background on we have one business item, project ADU-22-002, a public hearing to receive comments on a request from Brian Allen for a conditional use permit for a detached accessory dwelling unit, ADU at 2217 East Cottonwood Cove Lane in the rural residential RR1-43.
And just before, I do want to just briefly introduce Tim Thompson. He's with GeoStrata, who's our geologic hazards consultant. He'll talk a lot when we start talking sensitive lands. That's why he's here tonight. But
Thanks for being here.
case.
Glad to have you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, for starters, we'll go through pretty briefly, and then we can get into more detail when we get into the business meeting. But in interest of time, since we have a lot to go over. Oh, sorry, I'll do this.
Also, we'll just make a general disclaimer. We are without IT support tonight, and so your patience is appreciated as Andy and I kind of try to make ends meet here. So bear with us.
Full confidence you'll get.
Oh, that's one of us.
Okay, well, so the business item that we have to consider tonight is a detached accessory dwelling unit at 2217 East Cottonwood Cove Lane. This is the first accessory dwelling unit application for review by the Planning Commission. Some context, Cottonwood Cove Lane is just south of Brighton High School, east of Highland Drive. The subject properties highlighted on the map. For some context, we have the street view as well. Got more pictures of the accessory unit later in the presentation. It's in the RR143 zone. That's our rural residential zone, single 1 acre minimum lot size. ADUs are allowed, and we'll go through the code, but they're permitted in all residential zones. Detached ADUs are a conditional use permit requiring Planning Commission approval, which is why we're here tonight. I guess maybe we'll just give a brief explainer for those listening and those on the commission who maybe weren't around when we adopted this code. ADU ordinance, I'll go over the history as well, but it's a new code. This is a new type of application to review. So I thought it might be good to just kind of go through everything, make sure everything is clear. But an accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU, means a permanent residential dwelling unit meant for one additional single family located in a separate dwelling unit on the same lot as a single family dwelling unit, either within the same building as the single family dwelling unit or in a detached accessory building. Mobile homes or other portable structures do not qualify. And then we also have a definition for detached ADUs. Those are specifically for ADUs located in accessory buildings on the property not attached to the primary building. So this new ordinance that we adopted is in state code, House Bill 82, single family housing modifications was passed by the state legislature last year, requiring cities to allow internal ADUs. City had previously done research on ADUs and had considered an ordinance. It wasn't ultimately adopted before the state code, but as a response to the state requirement for cities to allow internal ADUs, City Council approved Cottonwood Heights ADU ordinance last year in September of 2021. And so it not only complies with the state requirement for internal ADUs, but also allows detached ADUs as a conditional use. So that's what we're doing tonight. For this particular application, and I know the text is a little bit hard to see on this, but guest homes are allowed in Cottonwood Heights and have been, I think, since we've been a city. They're required to meet all of the zoning requirements, bulk and massing standards for accessory buildings. The main difference here is that a guest home, number 6 in this section of the code, says the rental or lease of a guest house or the use of a guest house as a permanent residence for a second family on the premises shall be prohibited. So the difference between what was otherwise allowed is that, a guest home, you can have your family stay with you, you can have visitors, but you cannot rent or have a second family on the property. So it's an existing guest home, be converting to an ADU that would allow them to then rent that unit.
Let's be clear, that's 30 days or longer.
Correct, yes, and that's one of our, it's in the code. We've also added it as an explicit condition, just so that's clear. So some of the major requirements for detached ADUs are parking. They have to provide 2 additional parking spaces that do not block the required parking for the primary unit. On their site plan, they've called out in blue, those 2 blue squares are the ADU parking spaces. This building also happens to have a single car garage, and there's also additional space for extra cars if needed. The building also has to meet the setbacks that are required for single family dwellings. This was one thing that we wanted to clarify. So we asked the applicant to go measure. They did measure and confirm that it's 10 feet, which is the minimum size setback in the RR zones. And then another requirement is that there has to be a buffer, landscape, or fencing between, it says to buffer the entrance and the parking of the ADUs. So they've got a fence and some landscaping, show some pictures as part of this, but that'll be something for the Planning Commission to consider if they feel it's adequate or if maybe more is necessary. Here are a few photos. So this is from the driveway. This building in the front is the corner of the main house. And then you can see behind it is the guest home, the proposed accessory dwelling unit. Here's a close-up of the existing building. As you can see, there's the single car garage. And then here is a view looking to the east property line. So you can see there is a fence, but it's just like a wrought iron. And then there are plants, but they're not yet mature. There are mature plants on the other side of the fence, as well as a few accessory buildings. So there is a buffer there. We're not recommending any additional requirements, but that's something that the Planning Commission can consider.
Can you go back to the front picture?
Sure.
Is there another picture or the front of the house picture?
Sure, yeah.
So I don't have the PDF up, but was one of the 2 parking spaces somewhere in this kind of the bottom right-hand corner of that?
I think so, yeah. One directly in front of the ADU and then one down towards the bottom of the existing driveway.
How'd you guys square the secondary parking space with the shall condition of it not being in the front yard?
They can't create additional parking. I could pull up the language. I remember looking at that.
Yeah.
And I think the way that it's written is that they can't use an existing driveway or create the existing driveway behind the required spots and can't create new ADU parking in the front yard.
So the parking requirements from the quick perusal of the code that I saw, it was different than the internal versus the detached, but the detached had just a shall condition that said shall not have parking in the front yard. So it didn't really, it had the other conditions about the tandem parking in the front and back and whatnot, but it actually just had a separate condition about just not having it in the front
You
yard.
can pull up the code and take a look at that language as well. And then it is maybe pertinent to note, there is the one car garage in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
unit as well. So it could be something the commission considers of perhaps having that stall being used, and then maybe there's a way to scoot the other one. I don't know what the flexibility is there, but I think it is a benefit having that one car
Is there
garage.
is there concrete on the entire swath in front of the guest house?
Something that we could also probably ask the applicant to clarify. They are on the Zoom meeting.
Okay.
I think there is.
It looks like it from the photo.
It looks
Yeah.
like it from the drawing.
Yep.
I think it
I
is.
I
primary
see a
parking for the
pad
residents?
there.
It's got
There's a
car.
garage. You can kind of see it. It's a side facing garage.
Oh, it's there.
It's a
Car-
double stall.
2-car garage, yep. And a lot of, the circular driveway is a lot of.
And that picture was good because it showed you a
Yeah.
bump out that's
Yep.
existing.
Yeah.
So the requirement, the parking for detached says, let's see, creation of additional off-street parking spaces excluding previously existing driveways is prohibited in the front yard of the subject property.
Okay. Yeah.
Existing.
Yeah.
So I think we would not want it to be on an existing driveway if it blocked it.
Yeah.
But if it was previously existing and was
And
not
the
in the way.
curve, well, I guess that's the thing is like, so the curve kind of gives the ingress egress to the back. Does it give enough, is there enough room to kind of get around that to still go for the parking, if the car's parked there?
For the primary resident?
No, even for the ADU.
It does look like the applicant has raised their hand in the meeting, so if the commission sees it necessary, we could ask for clarification
Sure.
on kind of the
Or we
circulation.
can do that in a business meeting. That's a business meeting, of course. We're just looking at,
Yeah. I'm just kind of throwing it out there.
Clarification though.
So the
we'll get
second,
to you in the.
the second question I had was this was an existing permitted structure that was built and permitted and whatever else.
Correct.
So did I read the application correctly that one of the things that we have to opine on is the maximum height? Deviation.
The height just needs to meet
The zone.
the standards of the zone.
Which it
So
does.
that-
Okay,
That's already been. If I remember correctly, there was an original structure built about 10 years ago, and then I think it was 2019.
they added on to
Expanded.
it, yeah.
It
It
is
is a-
taller than 20 feet, and so usually an accessory building, the max is 20 feet. If you go taller than that in the RR zones, then it has to meet all of the requirements that a single family home would have.
That's why the 10-foot setback is
Yeah,
required in
yeah.
that case. But yeah, it was built as a permitted structure to be used as a legal guest house.
Okay.
And then the applicant is going through this process now that ADUs are allowed.
Yeah, just for the rental aspect, right? Yeah, I
I
get it.
imagine so.
Okay,
I think
And if I'm assuming this is Dan Mills, the chair. So just to the applicant, we'll look forward to some of those clarifications when we get to the business meeting. So please join us there and we'll look forward to hearing from you at that time.
great. Well, in interest of time, maybe we'll move on to the next item, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
We'll do a little computer handoff here.
Got the same.
Yeah, I've been training for how many years to do this in the pandemic, and I'm just still like. Okay, so if it's acceptable from the chair, we'll start the sleds discussion now. And I'm gonna kick things off with just a little bit of time spent on the riparian standards, and then we'll turn it back over to Andy to go through the larger chunk of sleds, which includes the hazard areas and development standards.
Great.
So this is the slide I wanted to show you guys at the last meeting, and I had technical difficulties. So I'm pleased to report it is in tonight's presentation. So as some background on the riparian standards, they are referenced in our existing Sleds ordinance. And just for anybody tuning in, Sleds is our abbreviation for the Sensitive Lands Evaluation and Development Standards Ordinance. So within that existing Sleds ordinance, riparian protection guidelines are referenced, but the chapter that is supposed to contain them does not exist. So basically you're directed to Appendix I. Appendix I directs you to chapter 17.31, and that chapter is not in city code. This discrepancy is being addressed as part of our overall Sleds update, and that's why we're bringing it at this time. A little refresher on research. So without an existing ordinance to build on and to iterate, we've been using a handful of different resources to get this working draft put together. So we had a lot of help from a 2019 U of U student capstone project. We've used a lot of existing riparian ordinances from Utah, as well as fellow Western communities. And then also some best management practices from a handful of groups. I won't read them all, but I will note that the most recent draft includes best management practices from the Utah State Engineer's Office and also the Salt Lake County Flood Control. And I'll discuss those additions in a little bit more detail as we progress here. So most riparian ordinances, including the draft that we're sharing with the commission, implement a buffered area system that basically divides property adjacent to a waterway into typically 3 segments. And then activities are regulated differently in each segment, with that closest to the waterway being the most restricted. So the way we've named things, the closest buffer area is Area A. That's from the top of bank 25 feet out. Area B is 25 feet to 50 feet, and then Area C is 50 feet to 100 feet. And I will just note that these buffer measurements are pretty par for the course. A lot of ordinances we saw were a little bit more restrictive, with even Area A being farther than 25 feet, but we're sharing these figures as a starting point for discussion. So in February of 2022, we brought this to the commission and just a really high level discussion of kind of the direction and the scope. You guys provided very helpful feedback and gave us some direction requirements from other agencies, looking into measurement protocols, our staff review processes, and also some mapping analysis. So we've tried to incorporate this into an April 2022 draft that was shared in your packet. And I wanted to just highlight some of the changes that were made in this most recent iteration. So those include requirements from other agencies, measurement protocols, staff review processes, and mapping analysis. In terms of the requirements from other agencies, we provided our draft ordinance to the Utah State Engineer's Office and also Salt Lake County Flood Control. And this was a great point that Commissioner Wild brought up. We were planning to coordinate with flood control, but hadn't yet coordinated with Utah State Engineering Office. So that was an excellent point that we were grateful to have. Both agencies were really supportive of the ordinance and the scope, and didn't identify any major issues. They did share with us kind of some minor feedback related to wording and some best practices, and shared with us kind of some additional resources that we might use. But we were pleased as staff to see that they were supportive and on board with the direction we've been taking. I do want to note that we plan to coordinate next with FEMA to request kind of a similar feedback process, as this can affect the floodplain and their processes. Yes.
I had a situation in another county where I did it, and Army Corps of Engineers was the guys that I had to deal with.
Excellent point. And we do have them incorporated into our table of uses. And the Utah State Engineer's Office did provide a little bit of context for how we might interface with the Corps of Engineer or Army Corps of Engineer, but we will coordinate directly with them as well.
I was surprised that they were the
Anything that's wet.
they were controlling in another county.
And that was in Utah, but
Oh, yeah.
okay, just a different county. Okay. Yeah, we
Summit
can,
County.
okay, we can coordinate directly with them. We do have a table of use designation for like their processes.
I just
but
see where you're asking other people. You
Yeah.
might.
I think the more
just bounce that
feedback
off
we
of
can
them.
solicit, probably the better. We want to make sure we're in step with requirements that are already in place. So I have made a note to coordinate with the Corps on that.
Sam, as another coordinating body, just because we're so adjacent, has there been any coordination with the folks up the canyon? Up
Oh, yeah, that's a
literally
great
like,
point.
you know, upstream, 1 foot over and suddenly it's Forest Service
Yeah,
jurisdiction.
excellent point. I have not coordinated with them yet, but let me add it to my list.
I'd be curious what their distance is.
Right.
Just to protect the water.
And I think a lot of that defers to Salt Lake County because it's unincorporated. So in that sense, we may have that level of coordination, but perhaps the Forest Service would have different
Great.
feedback. So
Thank you.
I've jotted it down. Okay. So the next item we updated was measurement protocols. The previous draft had us measuring from the annual high water line. We had some feedback, both from the commission, from staff, and also from these other agencies, that this threshold can just be really difficult to establish, and it might not be highly practicable in practice. So we've changed that to be measuring from the top of bank, which yes, can be a little bit more practically established through bank hinge points. I admittedly am not an expert on this, but in the light research I've done on it, it seems to be something that would just be a lot easier to implement in staff work. So there's a lot of good literature on kind of the measurement process going from top of bank and how that can be calculated with a single hinge point on a bank and also multiple hinge points if the bank is kind of terraced. So we have made that update in this iteration. Kind of a minor change here, but we clarified that the staff review process should flow through the larger development review committee, or DRC, rather than the single point of the public works director. This just gives us a little bit more flexibility in bringing in input from multiple departments. We also added language allowing the option for third-party experts if needed. We are so grateful to have GeoStrata consulting as a third-party expert on many issues, and we want to have the option to do that with riparian matters if
In that case, there's a lot other.
Yes. And then finally, we coordinated with our GIS department to prepare a map that kind of estimates the number of structures that might be impacted by these buffer areas. So obviously, kind of a running theme of Cottonwood Heights is a lot was built long ago, and a lot has been built without riparian standards. So we want to be mindful of maybe how that can be impacted by this update. So GIS conducted analysis including primary and accessory structures along Little Cottonwood Creek, Big Cottonwood Creek, and the above ground portions of East Jordan Canal. I have the link here and I am going to try to pull it up just so you can see the interactive map. But before I juggle changing screens, just wanted to note their analysis picked up basically 21 structures as within area A, which is the closest buffer to the waterway, 83 in the next segment, and then 84 in the third. And it's not exact because their measurements go from the center line of the waterway, not the top of bank, but this gives maybe a little bit of context of what we're looking at. So
And these are discrete numbers, right?
yes, they are. In one version of the map, they were kind of combined in like concentric, but these are discrete on this slide. So,
and Sam, just as a clarification, like if somebody's listening to this and they're suddenly worried that that their existing structure, there would be from a legal standpoint, I know we have Shane there, but these people would be grandfathered in.
that's correct. So I have
Nobody that
actually,
currently is in this circumstance is going to be affected by this change.
I'm going to scroll through on the packet and I wanted to show you the table of uses. So if you'll bear with me for 1 minute. We have quite a long packet for this meeting. I think it's 140 pages, which
I've just barely got through the February stuff.
kind of absurd. So if you see here on our table of uses, we have maintenance of any use or structure that's been lawfully established. That's an allowed use, so you can continue that, and that's consistent with our existing non-conforming use and structure chapter. So
Until a flood takes you out.
yes, that is in there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to try to switch over now to this. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen for 1 minute and then I'm going to reshare it.
Do you have any idea how many of these are habited?
That's a great question. The structures, you
Actual
mean?
houses.
I mean, I guess
dwellings?
most of them are
Yeah.
houses, but there probably are some
So
accessory
Sheds
buildings.
and decks
is
and stuff.
the
Yeah.
interactive map that GIS put together. I'm gonna zoom in here and it's gonna kind of lag as we zoom in and out. So I'm gonna try not to make you too seasick here. But they have a series of blue hues here, and let me bring up the legend.
Oh, that's well done.
So we have the nearest buffer is the darkest blue, and then getting lighter as we move outward from the waterway. And then we have the buildings in different hues of pink, indicating those that are within each buffer area. So I don't have the count of the buildings in each area on this map, but I just wanted to show you the great work that GIS did in mapping out these footprints and showing where they hit. And they did include, even if one corner of a structure was in the next rung,
That's nice.
they included it. So it's, you know, that may be an area of discussion, but even if a bit of the home touched into the next one,
Yeah.
they did include it. So
Do they count it, is it per parcel, or if you had a house with a garage or detached garage, does that count as two?
yeah, it's per structure.
Okay.
So it would
Structure,
be, yes,
Okay.
ideally too. And our GIS specialist worked with her intern on this. And so she was saying, like, we'll verify all the data, you know,
Yeah.
intern projects are so fantastic and share so much with us, but she's happy to do some additional verification on it before we use the numbers. So
Sam,
that's
Sam,
the-
another clarification. I know this is a general clarification, but I will probably get asked this when I drive back into my neighborhood after this meeting.
Since it's right
You'll be
there.
stopped in the road.
I think I know every single one of these people that you've highlighted.
Sure.
Not only would they be grandfathered in, but if they're remodeling their basement or something like that, and they're submitting an application to the city,
Mhm.
would they have to be concerned that because it's in a riparian area that they can no longer do anything to their home?
Fantastic question, and I'm going to answer it in two ways. So typically it depends on the degree of nonconformity and why it's nonconforming. So typically, if a nonconformity is related to, say, setbacks, we would say, as long as you're not making it more nonconforming by getting closer, you know, you can redo your basement.
So within the existing footprint of what you've already got,
Typically, that is how we
That would
handle
make
things
sense.
when they're related to planning standards like setbacks. In some geologic hazard areas, that can be a different case
Mhm.
because if a new standard has been introduced, it may have to, even a remodel may have to meet kind of the new standard for safety. So I wouldn't want to answer
Well-
that completely with surety, but those are the two ways we've handled it in past
Which
circumstances.
may very well be true by a waterway could do, say, window wells in a basement that.
There may be updated standards related to being near a waterway that would come into play, but that's also something that we can discuss with the commission.
I doubt there'd be any resistance. Every one of those people have experienced massive flooding at different times to
Yeah,
different
and if they-
degrees.
they
So
could mitigate
that
that.
this will not surprise any of those homeowners. They just, I think, want to make sure that they're not going to have their house torn down. as
Of
a result
course,
of this.
understand. And I think that's where they are covered under that item that allows for maintenance of existing legal structures. But I think that's just a good note for me to make, that maybe we continue to discuss what type of standards would come into play during redevelopment. Would that be helpful?
That
in
would be
addressing-
great. I think they would be, and they love the water, but they also see that you know, being in that close proximity, the need for a much stricter standard. And frankly, maybe even stricter than what we've described so far. For the
Sure.
sake of
And
preserving the creek.
it's certainly a purpose statement of this ordinance is to protect the habitat and protect the visual and recreation amenities of it, but to also assist in like flood control and disaster prevention. So
Thank you.
something we can look into. I've jotted that down. Is there anything else you guys would like to see on this map before I stop sharing this
You
screen?
know, I think just maybe the next step, which I think you've already described, is just figuring out how many of these are habited buildings, how many are, you know, outbuildings.
So you'd be interested in seeing that like a primary versus secondary structure? I think
Yeah,
that
I
would
mean-
probably be the classification there. Would that address your concern?
I think so, yeah. Well, as long as the secondary structure isn't habitable.
And I think we can do our best to ascertain that. Through GIS, you know, they're largely using aerial imagery,
Yeah.
so they may not be able
No,
to say with a surety, but we can look into it, absolutely. I'm just gonna switch back to our slides here.
If I could quickly, while you're pointing that out, the new code does have standards for expanding or replacing
does,
non-conforming buildings.
Mhm.
If you saw that, there are some requirements. As Samantha mentioned, no portion of the new footprint can be any closer to the top of bank total square footage of the portion of the footprint of the new structure is not more than that of the previous structure.
And I think that these
It might
relate really well
advisable if you're
to,
making changes.
this relates really well to like an addition or a rebuild. But I think it's also important that we find out just if you were doing like a remodel, you're not getting bigger, you're not building the structure, you're just.
Well, it's almost
Keeping the
maintenance in
footprint.
a way.
Right, and so
Yeah.
I just want to clarify for you guys, and I will do this at a future meeting, what the threshold is for requiring new standards.
Great.
So, but that is in there, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
But Sam, what's your anticipated timing on when we're expected to vote on this?
So it's part of so far the larger Sleds update, and so I think it would just be largely contingent on kind of the temperature of the commission on that effort. We can tease it out. There's nothing in here that says we have to do them together, but I think it's appropriate to bring them as one since they both relate to natural conditions. So I'm just kind of moving in step with the larger effort.
Have we
Like right now, the plan is to start public hearing in May.
Okay, have we received any public comment on this since it's been?
I have
before
not
a couple
received
meetings?
any formal public comment that could be, submitted and forwarded to you. Anecdotally, I've had a few residents chat with me just during staff time, indicating support for the riparian standards. So, nothing that I can put into writing,
Okay.
but sharing that anecdotally, yes.
Okay.
But it wasn't posted either.
It was posted
Oh, our meeting.
all in our noticing standards. For a work session meeting, it doesn't require mailed public notice. And also for a zoning text amendment, we don't mail public notices because they're citywide. But we did post the agenda that has these topics and also the packet per all Utah State Code requirements. I think that's,
This will go in the newsletter before the public hearing too.
That'd be
yeah, we'll
okay.
do more
Yeah.
outreach, absolutely. I think that's the end of the content I have to share with you. I want to leave as much time as we can for the big guns here with the rest of it. But are there any final comments or questions for me on the riparian standards?
No, thanks for all your work.
Okay.
And I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to now looking at the updated draft.
Yeah, I'm realizing I'm not turning enough this way. So Commissioner Bevan, if you have
No.
anything for me.
I will let you know.
Okay, you just yell. Great, I'm gonna toggle over now to our next presentation and then we'll pass it back to Andy. Thanks for your feedback, you guys.
Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
work.
Okay, I'm sorry for us being so rushed, but there's just a lot to get through. So and you'll see, we've got it a little bit parsed out so that hopefully we have enough time to review all of this. We do want to leave time at the end. So if you have more questions for the riparian stuff or anything that Tim or I go over with the rest of Sleds, hopefully if we can get through everything, we'll have some time for some Q&A. But actually, Tim, do you want to, I know we briefly introduced you, but do you want to introduce yourself or anything before we dig into some of these amendments?
Well, I'm a professional geologist. I work with GeoStrata. I'm one of the principals there. And I've been consulting with Cottonwood Heights City for just about as long as it's been a city. I think maybe a year after they incorporated. So I've been here a long time. I helped with the original Sleds ordinance. And I've been trying to work to help with the update, so.
We're glad to have you here with us, and for all the technical stuff, Tim's the real expert, so.
So all those references in here to our expert, that's you, Tim.
Well, we hope.
It's a treat to have Tim in person because we so often coordinate with him virtually. So thanks for joining us.
You bet.
So from our last meeting, my notes that I had from January were that, so we had reviewed a previous draft. A lot has changed since then, but some of the notes that I had were that the commission had questions about the 45-day review requirement. We'll go over that. Had questions about development on steep slopes. We looked at some different language for exceptions, and we've continued to tweak that and add to it. And we'll go over what's being presented tonight and take more feedback. You recommended that staff prepare a newsletter article before we take a public hearing or take any votes. So as Mike said, we're planning to do that. Again, kind of depending on how everyone feels and if we think that we're ready to take that next step, that would be the schedule. And then you requested an extended work session. So here we are. Hopefully this will give us enough time to get through at least the major changes. As you know, this is a comprehensive update of the entire chapter. And so it will take well over 90 minutes to go through every single change. But what I've done is in your packet, you've got the red line version that shows everything proposed. I prepared the memo, which kind of just hit the high notes, kind of highlighting the substantive changes. And then we're a little under an hour time, but I think we should be able to get through everything. I've got kind of 4 chunks for this presentation. We'll go over the new recommendations from Utah Geological Survey and discuss that. We've got some time to go over the slope requirements. I've got a few other ones that I want to highlight and bring to your attention. And then if we can get through everything, we should have time for Q&A. So the first thing, the major change that from the previous drafts you've seen is that we received feedback from Utah Geological Survey. UGS is a division of Utah Department of Natural Resources. They provide scientific information on geology and geologic hazards. So UGS has prepared guidelines for investigating geologic hazards and preparing engineering and geology reports called UGS Circular 122. As you've gone through the memo and the updates, you probably noticed that that is referenced pretty frequently in the new code. These are guidelines about geologic hazards and preparing reports. Those guidelines also include a model ordinance, which we pulled from heavily for this. And so the extent to which we want to do that, we'll discuss a little bit. They are guidelines, and so we may want to discuss how strict we want to be about our referencing to those guidelines. Just to point out some of the major sections where we're referring to the UGS, either to that document with the guidelines or to their other maps, layers, and other studies and recommendations. So we've added their mapping information to our geologic hazard study areas. So in essence, the current draft that you're reviewing says the geologic hazard areas include the city's maps, which we're now updating, UGS layers as outlined, and some additional areas where hazards may occur.
And their maps were updated in the last few years, right? What was the date?
I don't remember.
Adam McKean's map has just recently come out within like the last year.
Within a year?
Yeah.
And that's also something to maybe discuss and that we had considered was
Referencing the most current.
exactly, because they're pretty regularly updating their data.
What you learn is you learn a lot more, yeah.
Right. Every time we do a fault study or something, we get more accurate idea of where the hazards may be. And so I think that's probably something that we'll consider as we prepare a final draft. So there's the maps, and then in the appendices, so for fault studies, slope stability and landslides, debris flow, and rockfall studies, each appendix now references UGS guidelines for that specific hazard. This is a lot of text, but I wanted to draw attention to, and Tim, we may want to have you chime in on this, but these are pretty conservative standards, what we're pulling from. Some may consider it to be overly burdensome. For example, we've added a new section called Submittal of Geologic Hazard Reports. I won't read through the entire thing, but in essence, it now requires the geologist or engineer to stamp a certification that says, everything's been designed a certain way, is acceptable to a certain level of safety, that all hazards have been addressed, and that verifies that they have liability insurance up to $2 million. And I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, but it sounded like that may not be standard practice for most of these types of reports.
Yeah. So I was talking with Andy about this, and the UGS makes great recommendations, but they don't practice in the field. And so sometimes their ideas can be a little bit ahead of the curve of the actual practice. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's not what's being done. And some things may be problematic because they've never maybe practiced as a licensed professional before. So for instance, in my E&O insurance, if I give a warranty or a guarantee or a certification, it voids my insurance coverage. So I can't do that. So people have asked before, we want you to warranty or guarantee that your report's right. So a licensed professional is much like a doctor, a lawyer, or any other licensed profession. You practice in the state of Utah. Actually, it's illegal for me to give a warranty as a licensed professional under the state's laws, because I practice under the standard of care, standard of practice, and malpractice or negligence is what triggers my liability. So if you go to a doctor because you have cancer and you die, you can't sue him because you died unless he did something wrong that led to that, right? And so geologists, engineers are similar in that to get a actual certification, you may be able to call it something different and say that you want a clarifying document that all of the things that are in the report have subsequently been met to their approval or something. I mean, there's some way to do that, but actually to call it a certificate may be a little bit beyond. So
But you're still stamping the.
yeah, you're still stamping the report. You're going through and reviewing all their plans to make sure they're compliance. Well, this is another step. Once it's all done, come back again and give us something else. That basically, I think that what they're trying to do that says everything that's been done is done the way you wanted it, so you're not gonna have any problems. And we can't go that next step because we don't know if you're gonna have problems. I can do a fault study and absolutely get it right. And the next earthquake, a fault could appear that wasn't there before. I can't control that. And so I can't ever guarantee you that even though we've done everything according to standard, that you're going to have no problems down the road.
You can guarantee what you found.
What you found and what you've done and stand behind your work, but going the next step may be a little problematic. The other thing is insurance. And I'll just give you, so I am a practicing geologist as well as I consult for a number of cities in Utah. And I practice in most of the others that I don't actually review in. And one thing I found is that first of all of the large national or regional firms don't do any residential work anymore because that hits your insurance and raise your insurance. So all of the large Terracons and IE Coms and all the big national firms, they won't do any residential at all. And if the city, it's never to require a certain level of insurance has not been done in the state today. So if you were to come out with this that said, everybody that works on this project has to proffer their entire limits of their liability, which most people, we carry more than 2 million, but we limit our liability based on each project, how much of our liability we're going to negotiate with our client that we're going to put up. I mean, that's part of the process. So what'll happen is, my opinion is there will be a chunk of the remaining people that do residential work that just won't do work in the city because they're going to come to a home that's doing a remodel and they're going to make $5,000 on their study and put out $2 million worth of liability in case anything goes wrong. They're just going to walk away.
What is that in reference to? Let's go back to see what that reference. Written verification from issuer. And this is when the city hires this person or?
No.
Or when, okay.
No, that would be for
When Joe
everyone.
Q homeowner goes and says,
Yeah, taking that, our language
Yeah, it's-
shouldn't cover that.
It's when we tell someone, hey, you want to do this addition, you have to go do a fault study. And we won't accept the fault study unless in that study, we have proof that the person that did your fault study has $2 million insurance.
And
Yeah,
he's
that's
saying-
taking, I agree
It's a
with you, it's
step a
taking it
little
one
far.
step too
Yeah,
far.
that's too, it really does. And so my personal opinion, the unintended consequence of this, which may be just that the UGS has not practiced before, is a
Yeah.
large percentage of the really good consultants that have lots of work will say, I'm not going to do a $5,000 project and have $2 million for the liability. I'll just go somewhere else. So then the consultants that are left will charge an arm and a leg for the same amount of work because there's very little competition. And if you want it done, you're going to spend 5 times as much as you would have because I've got to cover my liability costs now. So to make it worth my while, your $2,000 study is going to be $15,000 now. And if you don't want to pay that, then there's nobody else to go to.
So is clause 5, is it really that you're asking for each one of these projects to add the individual person as a named insured on the E&O policy?
To verify that the geologist and engineer
Is carrying
are
that liability.
covered.
But that's not what that says. It says that you want a written verification from the issuer. The issuer is the insurance company.
Right.
Right.
So typically how you do that is that you add in, if I have a client, let's say I have UDOT as my client, and they want what this language is saying, I have to add UDOT to my actual insurance certificate. And we've had to do this with clients before, but that's how I read that. That's what it's saying, not just that the person carries $2 million of E&O.
Right, and that's one of the steps so
Yeah.
far, but it's also that we're mandating it as the city for a private, the
sounds
person who's
like-
hiring that.
Sounds like there's maybe
geologist.
general consensus or feeling among the commission that might be
We're in agreement with
beyond
you
the
on that.
scope.
I think
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Let's go back to the
Oh,
second.
sure, sure.
So if we're gonna use a physician example, I will say, and I'm not a physician, but I would say that it is the standard that there is documentation that you perform the surgery, describing the surgery that you performed in detail. And that's required, not just saying, I did the surgery. You know,
Right.
So, and by signing that note, you've provided documentation that in essence is written stamp certification, despite being a licensed professional,
Right.
that you did exactly what you said you did and how you did it, and the length and breadth and the complications. And could the patient still die? Yes, but there then is documentation there. So I don't know if I have that same heartburn with the UGS standards. And I also am concerned too that if we adding a higher standard, you know, that number 5, anytime that I've done contract work with the federal government, that's a typical expectation. I mean, and not something, and something that could
But
literally
that's
just
you
be-
contracting directly with them. It's not, so what
third
this is
party.
taking is, this is a third party. And that's where I think the overstep is.
the,
Showing that you have insurance, fine,
I-
but showing the city that you have the insurance,
So maybe it would
is
be
that
for-
really what we intend?
Are you
the-
saying maybe it would be something for a project or an applicant to say, I want to have verification that they have this?
If it was me hiring you, I
Sure.
would like to know that. you
But
have
maybe
that,
not
yes, but-
appropriate role for the city to play, is that what you're?
Right,
Okay.
for the city to mandate that.
but I disagree with you because I have to show that to the federal government in order to deal with the entity that I'm dealing with directly. For example, Utah Transit Authority, I have to show to the federal transportation people that I have met a particular standard in order to deal with the local entity.
Mm.
So I don't know that this is without precedent. I think we just have to decide what our tolerance is. And
Right.
as far as the increased cost, the idea that somebody develops a specialty niche area from a market forces standpoint, I do think that there is inherent risk on building on faults.
And they're carrying
And
that level
so-
of insurance anyway. It's just not for that particular incident.
So if the price goes
Well-
up $15,000, and as a result, that if you're building in areas where there are potential faults, that there's a deeper dive or a higher standard, I think there may be an argument to be made that might be warranted. I'm not settled on that yet, but
Well,
I
I
just want
think
to
this
point that
language
out.
actually does say it's the overall policy. It's
Right.
not for that particular.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, I don't disagree. I mean, we carry insurance. And I think almost I can't say I've looked at every single contractor, subcontractor that's going to a professional service, right? But most everybody I know, they all carry insurance, right? But it's a matter of, for a particular job, how much risk are you willing to take to do the work for what you're getting paid? And so it is a standard of practice in our community that we negotiate with our clients how much liability we will cover for that particular project. So a client may come to me and say, I've got this project, and maybe not in the city, but it's a little riskier, but I really want to do this. And we're like, well, you know, we think we can really help you. And again, with geologic hazards, the standard has always been to reduce the risk to a reasonable level. A good example of that would be you as a city mitigate a 100-year storm event in order to get out of FEMA flood zones. Why not the 200-year? Why not the 500-year? Why not the 5,000 flood? I mean, you could, but it would be prohibitively expensive for cities to do that. So the federal government requires the 100-year storm event, not thinking at all that that's going to prevent all flooding ever, but it's going to reduce the hazard to a reasonable risk.
Right.
Another thing would be liquefaction mitigation for that hazard. The IBC and the IRC, the Residential Building Code, as well as all of the geologic hazard ordinances in the state will exclude single-family residences from the requirement of mitigating a liquefaction hazard. The reason for that is it's just cost prohibitive to do that on a single-family residence. So if you're building a big apartment complex or a store or a church or anything like that, you're going to mitigate that hazard. But even the IRC puts single-family residences out of that because it's just too onerous on a single-family residence to do that.
So if this were to apply, which in a lot of cases it applies to a developer who's taking a whole subdivision down,
Right.
right? That's a different incidence.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, it's not that you wouldn't want to make sure that somebody's got insurance and that they're set up professionally, but I'm saying to make each and every project have a minimum of $2 million worth of liability coverage. I just don't know that you'll have a lot of people that will want to proffer that much liability. Because what winds up happening, I love attorneys, Shane, I really do love attorneys. But the last time that we got sued working for a city, there was a landslide that occurred within that city. And the attorneys on the other side negotiated in this lawsuit for 3 years. And then they all came to a mediation and realized that there was no money to settle the case. So they said, oh, well, there's 2 engineering firms in the background somewhere. And so they held a few depositions and then said, oh, we just realized that we didn't know that you did something to damage us. We just found it out now. And so we're pulling you into the lawsuit, knowing it's never going to go to court and knowing that. So what we got sued, I'm being open here, but we got sued was we reviewed something for the city on this hillside that was a minor slip failure that was being fixed. And the city just said, hey, could you give us some advice on whether you think that they're mitigating this little failure properly? Then a developer came in a year later and the city, without even talking with us, reviewed a development permit, allowed them to build, and then another portion of that slope failed. And the proffer from the attorneys was, you should have told the city not to allow any development on top of that slope, so you damaged us. And we're like, well, we weren't asked to review that. The report was turned in after, the city never gave it to us to review. And the argument was, well, you shouldn't have let them do it anyways. I'm like, no, you don't understand. They never asked us to review it. I know, but it's your fault anyways. Well, they knew that once they got our insurance in the room, we were going to give them something to settle. It didn't matter if they could prove the case or not. They just had to get it by the judge to allow it to be included. And then that's how they settled the case. Was the 2 insurance companies came in, had to proffer something. I didn't want to settle. I'm from New York. I would have gone right to the mattresses with them. But the insurance company wasn't willing to take that risk, so they settled. And so when you look at a project, you see how much money. When I work with a city, we have $2 million with the city, right? Because we do a lot of work here and we know that that's what the city needs. But if somebody wants to build an addition on the back of their house, and we're willing to help them because we like to try to help people if we can, I would walk away from a project if I knew that every single thing that could go with that project, somebody could pull me in and the full limits of my liability.
All right,
could be out. So that's a big problem, I think.
I think we're kind of getting down the rabbit
Just to
hole
give you
here.
that.
Sure.
So let's leave that as an open question. I think understanding what the issues are.
I
Yes,
think what I'm
what I have
hearing
down.
that we want to have some form of verification that things are done right and they're safe.
And now we
And
know what to
the-
look for in the UGS suggestions.
There is some
Yeah,
form of,
I
Maybe
don't feel like
coverage
this is
and
a settled
accountability,
issue by quite.
I don't think it's gonna
quite a
settle here,
stretch.
but we have a lot to
I
talk
think-
about,
I
though.
think,
That's not insurance.
I need to finish my thought.
Okay.
I think we'll look forward to the public comment period and we'll get some more feedback. I really appreciate the input and the legwork that's been done so far. And we have a lot riding on this as a city because of the potential areas for development that have been discussed at length are right along major fault zones, and who's responsible for what, both private and commercial, is extremely critical in terms of the city's liability. So these ideas should not be understated. So let's be thorough and complete.
We've got it jotted down as a topic to continue discussing and to continue to refine the appropriate role for the city. So
Sounds great.
There's
Without
middle ground on this also, just because I've been on both sides of that issue and I've certainly done plenty of contracting with government where it's just a requirement. And if you want to do business with them, you just accept the condition. But I've also done it where you've negotiated to limit it to your overall scope of the contract. But there's also kind of middle ground where you take off like half of that sentence, where they just have to have proof of $2 million of liability. And if it doesn't necessarily apply, where it doesn't stipulate that $2 million applies, maybe that's the middle ground.
Yeah.
Because then it's up to the attorneys on whether or not they can bring it in or not, or whether the contract was, valid or whatever.
Thank
No,
you for
those are
the
great
robust
Yeah.
discussion, and let's keep moving forward. And
talk
I
about
love the
slopes.
level of engagement.
Sure, we've got a little over half an hour left, so we'll try to get through as much as we can. Next one is slopes. This is one that I certainly want input on. Let me just read through this exception and open it up for some conversation. So the way our new ordinance is proposed says no development, including structures and retaining walls. That's new. We wanted to clarify, previously development was only new homes or additions. So this would include any structure or retaining wall is permitted on slope areas in excess of 30% with the following exception. Slope areas in excess of 30% may be developed upon finding that they're smaller than 1 acre in size. They're clearly isolated from other areas that exceed 30%. Their disturbance or removal will not create unstable geologic or drainage conditions that result in damage to public or private property. The city engineer has approved a site-specific slope stability study performed by qualified engineering geologists and geotechnical engineers, which meets all requirements of this chapter. And this exception shall not apply to natural slope areas in excess of 30% connected to the Wasatch Mountain Range as determined by the director. So the feedback that we have been hearing is we want to allow small little slopes that are not part of a huge, think of, maybe, around Crestwood Park and Target, some long continuous slope that affects other properties, or the natural foothill areas. So this is our attempt to try to address some of those concerns while still allowing limited disturbance under an acre. But we're open to suggestions.
How does this impact? I mean, this was in the other meeting, you had a presentation where you're showing pictures of up on
By the
Wasatch.
old mill,
Yeah. How does that? There was some discussion on condition A1 or AI.
The size, yeah. I tried to pick basically somewhere kind of in the middle. The Saratoga Springs ordinance is a ½ acre. Some of the examples of different kind of piles and smaller slopes that we found range from ½ acre to like 4 acres. Some of the big piles on the gravel pit, and those may or may not apply, but
I think we had one down by Crestwood, for example, that was just a goofy little corner of the hill that stuck out there, and the guy was trying to fix it, and it was, there needed to be some kind of an exception other than to say, that's it.
Yeah.
Tough
It's
things.
challenging maybe to know the trigger to do
Right.
that at, because if you have like a pile of dirt in your yard, the LiDAR could maybe pick that up as 30%.
Right.
The metric I think is a puzzle. So your feedback.
Isn't there
is
an
just
appeal
tricky.
process to this? Is there an appeal, or is this just me?
Yep, we have an appeal process that applies to this, anything in this chapter.
Okay.
So there is that. One thing that, so I went over this with the Public Works Department and engineering. They want to just do an analysis of all the slopes to see where this would apply. So we haven't done that yet. Want to prepare something like that for our next review.
The other thing, just as far as looking at the sizes, 1 acre in our, the developments is the mostly suburban development around here. These are like quarter acre lots
If
or
that.
less. So you could impact, if you change the slope on yours, it impacts anybody else who's on that slope having a neighbor who did a bunch of road grading now change the water flow on my property. And I'm not alone. We're in a very sloped area. Keeping those things in mind, I think as a metric is important.
So just if I get, I just want to clarify, first of all, I'm giving you my honest gut reaction opinions. I honestly don't have any, I don't practice in the city because I consult here, right? So I don't have any horse in the race, but I'm just giving you to make good decisions. So I brought this up originally because I'm trying to rectify two different parts of our ordinance. So the one says, let's say you have a lot that's 20%. You right now can go in and cut your lot to be a 50% slope or fill it to be a 50% slope right now. Because the cut and fill section allows cuts and fills up to 2:1, which is 50% slope. But if it's a natural slope at 30%, you can't touch it. But if it's not, if it may be shallower than 30% because the material, this natural strength doesn't allow for it to be at a slope steeper than that. So you can actually go in and cut a clay hillside that's at 29%, make it a 50% slope and maybe have a problem where you could have a gravel area that's at 40% because it's strong enough to handle that. And you wouldn't allow them to grade it to the 50% that they could if it was less. So I'm trying to come up with a way to, and that's why what we want to do is have a geotechnical study. And in our ordinance, we don't allow for anything on any property that impacts a neighboring property. That's already a condition of our report. And so whenever they do any grading, we require them to have a grading plan and a drainage plan that documents where all of the drainage on the property is going to go from. And they have to consider every adjacent condition that could affect theirs or that theirs could affect the adjacent condition. So, but it is, your point's well taken. Sometimes it could go wrong, right? But we already allow cutting and filling steeper than that. As long as it starts out a little bit less than 30%, you can make it up to 50%. So why, if it's a 28% slope and somebody wants to just flatten something out, would you prohibit it if the engineering says it makes sense?
Right.
Because we wouldn't want them to do that even if it was less than 25%, if the engineering said it was still unstable. So we're trying to cut, that's what we're trying to do, to bridge both of those things and try to make it cohesive, and both parts of it make sense.
And how does that fit into this determination of what size would make sense to make that cutoff at?
And part of the argument is, let's say right now you go to the gravel pit. We have a slope there that is at least partially a problem, how steep it is, right? But it's not a native slope. So this part of the ordinance wouldn't touch it because it's not a native slope. So they can go in and modify it because it's already been graded. And we've had a couple others that we reviewed where when we didn't feel comfortable with the slope modification, they said, well, it's not a native slope. It was graded in the past because of some aggregate mining in the past. So the ordinance doesn't apply to this because it's not a natural slope.
Is that the carve out for a Roman numeral 5?
That's, yeah, well, it's the one for number 4, which is they have to have a geotechnical study and demonstrate, but through the science, that it's something that can make sense to begin with. And then if it connects to the main hillside, the director has the ability to kind of come in and say, well, we're not comfortable with it, even if it does make sense, because it's contiguous with the Wasatch Slope, and we don't want to do that.
For Roman numeral 5, though, what's kind of the bright line determination of connected to the Wasatch Mountain range?
It's really up to the director. And Andy and I had to talk about that because you can be on the slope, like up in the Mile High Drive area, and those are right up to the mountain front. But you can come down onto the Bonneville Bench where it's flat and then it gets steep again. Yeah. But that's not necessarily connected to the Wasatch Front unless you consider it the flank of the front. But someone will argue that's not this, that this is a deposit out in front of this. And it's a good question. Right. It's going to be contested by whoever wants to do something there. Is it actually part of the slope or not?
Right.
But that's why the other parts have to be consistent.
There might be some good pieces of feedback up in Commissioner Coots's area. The stuff that borders that has existed in many cases close to 50 years that would all be grandfathered in at this point. Just talking to residents who have built in some retaining walls and different structures and plenty of people who've had stuff that has naturally been torn down just by the effects of nature on it. I don't know that there's been, major avalanches or loss of life or major property damage, but there may be some good lessons learned, and that group has a unique set of information about that connectedness to that Wasatch Range, and that boundary is almost our entire eastern border from the mouth of Big to the mouth of Little. And those are the people really that were that A5 is going to apply to. I don't know that there's a lot of new stuff that hasn't been worked on.
Tim, do you think it's relevant to try to spec out, like, these are the properties or this is the region that we identify as being connected to the Wasatch Range, and then allow it to be like disputed on a case by case basis? Or is it just something that you think is appropriate to be determined by a director?
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question. And in thinking about it different ways, that is a possibility to do. I'm a proponent personally, now you're going to hear Tim's view, that it's more important that this decision be made based on engineering and science. Here's two reasons why we have what we have with the 30% slopes. A lot of communities want to protect their view sheds. And so they do that by limiting how high up on the hill you can go by limiting the slope.
Yeah.
But that's really not a geologic hazards issue. That's a view shed issue. And we had some of that in the old ordinance. And I told Mike and Andy, we should take that out and deal with that separately under some other code in the city that just upfront describes the fact that we're trying to preserve whatever quality is important to the city. And that's a separate issue of geology, okay? Personal opinion, this is mine, personal opinion. The other issues should be done, I think, based on engineering. The reason why 30% was picked is in the late 90s, about 97, 98, Frank Ashland and Mike Hillen with the UGS published two publications, one for the Wasatch Front and one for the area around Jordanelle and Heber Valley. And they looked at all of the landslides, they did inventory of all of the landslides that they could map in that area. And they found along the Wasatch Front, like 75 to 80%, somewhere in there, I can't remember, of all the landslides that are currently existing are on slopes of 30% or greater. And when you go below 30%, the number of landslides really diminishes. Actually in Wasatch County up there, it was 25%. And I helped them with their ordinance. They decided to stick with the 30% like down here in the Wasatch Front, even though the publication up there said that those volcanics up there might be more susceptible to that side. So that's where that 30% came from. Everybody's latched onto it, but they use it for two separate reasons. One is to try to limit landslides. The other is to protect view sheds. And I think you need to separate those two issues and deal with what's actually a slope stability issue and what is a quality of the community issue and deal with them separately.
And I might point out that along those properties, the ability for them to do things in their backyard, they're going to affect other people's views or the people below them, I think is pretty limited generally. I mean, we've got that scenario in other parts of the city, overlooking Willow Creek, for example, the bench drops and the people facing east, but none of those are contiguous with the mountain range. I love the 30% number. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, but the view shed area and the 30%, I don't think that the view shed area that we would deal with would be probably coming out the other way and people having to look up at whatever you're doing. The stuff adjacent to the Wasatch Mountain Range, people are right next to each other, and it's just, they're kind of cutting into the slope to where their property line is to have a little bit of a backyard. And so they're, as long as they use good engineering principles to not have something pushed down, we're kind of saving them from themselves,
Right.
so to speak. And I'm not talking about crazy amounts of engineering, but you throw up, 8 railroad ties, and then you're surprised that they fell down 4 years later because the ground pushed them down. I'd love to try to help mitigate that. That it's like, okay, there's some anchoring techniques from an engineering standpoint that we could require that would allow you to still have your backyard, but you may have to engineer it a little bit more than just throwing up some railroad ties.
Well, and that's kind of what we're saying is no retaining walls if that's part of the mountain range, which would be restricting to a lot of existing residences. And as Tim says, this is kind of a policy choice. And so we're trying to take a stab at what we're hearing from these meetings and from the public. We could maybe try to draw this as a map.
I have it jotted down as an
Or
idea.
look at other
It'd be
ways
interesting
to
to
do
see.
it.
Yeah.
It might be at least a starting point for how we determine it as staff.
I think it's good to have the 30% standard as the starting place and just say, if you would like to try, even though you're at 30%, there is a rigorous set of things that you can do and go to the city to see if they will consider allowing an exception to that. But it's good to have, I think it's good to have the standard. And then I think it's probably good to have a reasonable process for an exception if it makes sense and the engineering's done, you're comfortable as a city with the plan that they've come up with. It seems to make sense. It gives a little bit of flexibility. It's not quite so, like you said, so rigid, just, at this point, you just can't do anything.
Somebody dumped a couple of dump trucks full of dirt here and changed the slope and.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which has happened. I mean,
Yes,
there's
it has.
every one of those people that built up there, once they excavate it, they decide what they want the natural contour of their backyard to be flat. And where that juncture is to their property line, they decide to cut from their property line straight down to whatever was going to keep their backyard nice and flat. And I think there's a lot of those. I mean, I can think of probably 20 that I know of that were there at least in 1985. They may have changed it, but I think there's a fair number of those that exist.
Yeah.
I want to do just a brief time check. We have about 15 minutes till we head into the next meeting. Are you guys ready to
Let's
Yeah.
keep going. Great
Okay.
job.
Let's skip forward to the kind of rapid fire. I think we've got some general sense, but
It's a big project.
It's a lot, it's a lot.
I want to point out some of the other significant changes that we haven't seen yet. So one that's brand new is a new appendix for avalanches. There's no map for this. And so what was in the model ordinance that we're referencing
Now we're at 47%.
is elevations of 5,000 feet with adequate snow supply to produce snow avalanches, and which includes slopes greater than 47%. So I went and looked at our map, and this red line is the 5,000 elevation,
It's my neighborhood.
which is,
Lucky girl.
it actually cuts through like the cemetery.
That's
Wow.
It's pretty deep
Yeah, it's
into the city. We may look at adjusting that or.
Yeah, I think if you take a look
adapting
at that
accordingly.
along with the percent slopes, you might, you certainly will take a lot of the flat part out as you move a little bit closer to the mountain where it gets a little
Utah
steeper.
Avalanche Center is 30% is really.
Where-
number for
Where
them.
does that roughly, where's Wasatch Boulevard in comparison to the red line?
Let's see,
Just
will
above
it-
it.
will it let us zoom in?
Yeah, you should be able to go in. It's a little clunky, but you should be
Yeah.
able to.
So this is, Wasatch is right along
Okay.
here.
So it does dip a bit below. Andy was noting it goes into the cemetery. So
So
it-
this
a
is
little farther.
Bywater
Yeah, it
Park. Here's the cemetery.
Waterworks.
This is
So
where.
this
uh,
is an avalanche
Smith's is.
zone? Is that what we're
Well,
saying?
if it's above this
That'd be a
line
big avalanche.
and
Sure,
has
down
enough
there.
snow for an avalanche
A lot of
and
houses.
steep enough
Bye-bye.
slopes.
That red line is just
I'm only
indicating
70 years
the
old.
They're at the
5,000.
5,000.
Elevation.
Avalanche.
Just the topo.
Yeah.
Say that again.
I'm only 70 years old, so I'm not in
You are a young
geological
guy.
terms.
You're very young.
But gosh, I can't
Geologically,
remember of an avalanche.
And herein,
There's
I've
no
made several
snow
comments to
anymore.
Andy about this. One of the things that you just document this very well is try to just incorporate everything that could possibly happen. But when you put a boilerplate section in, it may not be a really great fit and you may need to tweak it for your city. And this may be an instance where you may want to take a look and say, where do we really believe an avalanche is like? It's probably not likely to occur off the mountain and come across Wasatch Boulevard and go
That
6
would be amazing.
subdivision streets
So
in.
maybe it just
Or
needs to
come out of
water.
Smith's parking lot
Even then,
and hit the cemetery. I
Right.
just don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I don't know, if
so,
your building's really high, you could avalanche right off. the
It
bridge.
is good to know, though, kind of like what Andy was saying, it's not just that demarcation, but properties that have that and then are the 47%
Right.
slope and the sufficient snow.
Well,
So
right, there could be a few.
this red line is not necessarily
If
the
there's ever
full
been one.
inclusion.
Right, so I wanted to just point out that's new.
It's
We're
different.
gonna look closer and maybe tweak it, but.
I don't think we need to
That put a
have an
smile on our
ordinance that
face, I
says
like
we
that.
need tornado
We have a lot of people that
Sign-
become very aware
we
of
just don't
avalanches
need
in Cottonwood Heights. And
Yeah.
You'll get a lot
we
of
may not,
success with this.
maybe we
may
can,
have.
we can take out
And
the
Alta,
avalanche.
and Alta needs to have avalanche things in place.
But there are a few streets in the city that potentially back up to slopes that could potentially have this hazard.
That's true.
I think it's limited, but I think that there are a few. And avalanches could be a hazard that could pose. I mean, I think Annie's point with this is a good one. I think here is going to be a wise application of the area where it's required.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily bad to require it. It's just required in the right areas for this.
So this means that they would have to pay a geologist to research it. Is that what we're saying?
Well, there are very few actual avalanche consulting experts in the state. I can think of one that does these type of studies.
I hope
But-
it takes you to lunch after this.
But I think that there are ways that you could assess this hazard for homes that are backing right up onto the slope
Well-
or that are in the mouth of the canyon, things that where this is a real legitimate potential hazard.
Well, and you think about what's still undeveloped up along that boundary, there's still a fair bit of land up there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I think if applied in the right area, this would be a good thing to have.
Okay.
All right, avalanches, we got it.
Okay, structural fill, this is something Commissioner Chapel had been working on, and we may want to expand this conversation when she's with us, but a technical thing that Tim helped explain to me, but the structural fill is compaction criteria that is required underneath structures and needs to meet certain percentages. I've been informed that some of these changes are wrong. So this will be updated again. We just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this was one of the recommendations from the commission.
And I like that you've referenced a base designation that'll help you from having these numbers change.
Mhm.
So we'll continue to make sure this is accurate in the final version. Just wanted to draw your attention to it. Architectural design, we are removing the planning commission from this. It's just to be consistent with our current standards for architectural review. So the old version of the code had the,
Is there an instance when something goes to the ARC that doesn't come through the planning commission?
yeah,
Yes.
any external change to a building that's in the gateway zone.
If it was just like a
If it's
remodel.
already a use that's.
Even like a new sign on a business. Yeah,
If it's not a new site
Lighting.
plan, but it's just like we're doing a facade change, that would just go to the ARC.
Right, okay.
in
Just
this
wanna be clear
case,
on what that means.
there are some in our gateway zones, which are Wasatch Boulevard, Fort Union, Highland, the main corridors that may also be in a sensitive lands district,
Mhm.
in which case they have to meet the sensitive land standards and also have a design review. In this case, we're just clarifying that we want the Architectural Review Commission to do that design portion of the review. That's standard. That it would also apply to a planned unit development. PUDs have design standards that have to be approved and reviewed. And so just in addition to the city's normal design guidelines, we have these additional ones, if it's in a sensitive area, that say, we also need to be looking at the design to be compatible with the natural area. Most of our sensitive lands areas are either on the hillside or by a river or by one of the creeks. So just clarifying that we're still gonna have those design standards, but have the Architecture Commission. look at
And
those.
the Utah Wildland Urban Interface Code, where does that exist?
I looked it up. I think there is, the state of Utah either adopts this or references the Wildland Urban Interface Code. It's a fire protection standard.
code, right?
FFS.
Which makes sense to me, but I saw the reference and I went, well, what does this refer to specifically?
the design.
What is it? Yeah, I assumed it was that exactly.
We could also
It's
find
in
it
the
in,
fire code. It's a.
It is.
Fire
we
department
can maybe
standard.
find it and distribute it to you guys if you want to look at it.
That'd be
too.
good to make it, yeah.
Sure, I've got it
Available.
jotted down.
Okay, a couple more minutes left. We're almost
You
through.
guys are doing great.
The appeals process, this is similar to what you saw last time. So the original code just has kind of a standard, the appeals hearing officer will hear the appeals. The last draft, we had revised it to say, instead of the appeals hearing officer, the city would assemble a panel of experts to hear appeals on technical disputes on sensitive lands issues. We've now kind of merged those, so it still says the city's appeals hearing officer is the appeal authority for disputes, but that the city may assemble a panel to assist with technical disputes. So that's been kind of our middle zone, that we still keep the same process, but it have now built into the code a way for experts to be consulted when it's something of a technical nature.
Is there a reason, Andy, for eliminating just keeping it as the 3 qualified experts instead of the hearing officer?
I think that I actually recommended that change because it's more consistent with our administrative land use appeal process. Bringing in 3 experts and then giving them that quasi judicial authority is a little abnormal, and I'm not sure we're comfortable with that. But where we have an appeal hearing officer who understands the legal process for appeals, who can
And a
then bring in a
technical group.
panel that will
If they,
advise the hearing officer who then makes the final decision, that fits the flow of how land use appeals work better.
Yeah,
and you only bring the panel in if the appeals officer,
If needed, yeah. I mean,
if needed, so
Yeah.
that,
Can the
so as a
applicant-
general flow of things, they work fine, everything's great. And if needed, there's at
There's
least
some
another
real
option.
technical questions that have.
so that appeal officer becomes a very, very, very critical position in the city, because
Yes.
the ability for them to
Gatekeeper.
turn things one direction or another, it will be critical that that person is completely unbiased without any impact one direction or the other, and any
Yeah.
number of issues.
Absolutely.
So the way this is written, though, it's at the city's discretion whether or not to assemble it, not necessarily a trigger by the applicant.
Or the
At this
officer.
point, it's the city may
Yes.
assemble.
Well, because appeals are appeals of city decisions.
Right.
So if a decision is complicated and relates to a complex technical geologic requirement, then we would say, hey, we would like to assemble this panel.
I'm just playing devil's advocate of if there's a project the city may not want, even if there's a technical dispute, the way this is legislatively written, you can get around that.
Yeah, you're saying they may assemble, and it maybe should say upon request, they must assemble.
Well, I think an appellant can always bring in a panel of experts to support their argument if they want to do
So it's
that.
been
they
different.
wouldn't be the
This is the
decision.
city,
Yeah.
it's the city's option to.
But they
Right.
wouldn't be the decision-making body if they brought it in. So I see your point. If it's an either or and it's at the city's discretion, I like you having the option to being able to direct it, but how we describe that policy-wise, I think, we want to make sure we're not leaving it open.
Yeah, it's,
Do you have any, would you?
You're saying a city wants a decision to be overturned and we would intentionally not bring in
No,
authorities to.
No, I think that you want to make sure that an appellant wouldn't say, well, if you'd gotten 3 independent people, this would have turned out differently. Or conversely, that, well, if you'd use your appellate officer, so it would be a catch-22 for us as a city. So making sure that the threshold where you would bring in the 3 experts versus use the appellate officer, that,
But they can't-
whatever, if you're comfortable that having both doors open, that there's no jeopardy there, I don't have any heartburn. with
yeah,
it.
I don't know how the appeals process works, but it's just like, it's almost like removing this as a potential appellant issue that they could then litigate against the city for, because if they have it at their option, then didn't use it, they can't ever bring up as some kind of appeal issue of like, well, we wanted to do this, but the city wouldn't allow it.
Maybe that's something Shane can weigh in a little bit on too.
So
For
the
sure.
other thing to bring in here is the appeals procedure is set by the city manager
Okay,
on a case by case basis.
okay.
I think our default would be, hey, is this a sensitive lands related issue? Let's lean towards bringing in the experts unless it's like,
Slam dunk.
yeah.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Okay,
Great. Great response.
4 minutes.
Okay,
Tom.
I think this is the last one, so we're doing great. The last one, and this was something that was discussed last time, was this: city will complete each review in a reasonable time frame not to exceed 45 days. And Tim, you can probably speak to this. We discussed it a little bit, but I think the intent here, by putting a number to it, it eliminates the arguing over the previous language, which was the city will act diligently in reviewing. someone may argue, you didn't do this in a week, you're not being
Arbitrary.
diligent. And so by putting a number, that's a set time, there's no arguing, but setting it out for 45 days allows time for if it's a really big, a fault study that's hundreds of pages, potentially allows time for a full and complete review.
I think I brought this up before and I don't remember Shane's answer on it, but does the interpretation of this mean that if the city doesn't opine at the 45 days, it's administratively granted?
That is the trigger for building code. I'm not sure how it would apply to sensitive lands.
Well, with building code, it's a step further than that. It's if the review is not done, then the applicant says, I need this review done. You have another certain amount of time.
Okay.
And if it's still not done, then it's
Then it's-
granted.
then it's-
Is that codified in
That comes
the
from
process or the
state
code?
It's Utah State. Code.
Okay,
Would it be beneficial to maybe expand on this to say,
It seems like it should be consistent.
yeah, I would think so.
something similar, if the review's not done, you can request it, and if not,
I wouldn't
Same
want to,
reference you have for the other, right?
For the building
State
code one.
ordinance, We can
Yeah.
just reference that.
I just wouldn't want like a really complicated project and then we're at the 45 day and then we just time out.
Sure.
Do you guys need more
Yeah.
time than 45 days?
I think it would be good to give us some wiggle room on that.
That's my only thought is that, I mean, I don't have any heartburn with 90 days. If you
Right.
guys, I mean, if things get messy and we end up having to get other contractors involved, I just want you guys to have whatever time you need.
Middle of summer.
And I mean, under promise and over deliver, that it says 120 days, 180 days, and we get it back in, we get it back in 30. You know?
Well, we can review the language that's in the state code and maybe bring that back.
Whatever you guys think. you
Most
can live with.
reviews are pretty reasonable to get out in 45 days. If you want to say, that's 6 weeks. If you want to say 45 business days, that pushes it to 8 weeks. You reach a point where if it's too long,
Yeah.
people are going to challenge it. Because
Sure.
if you hold their development up for 3 or 4 months, every single round,
Right.
time is money. Some people have earnest money and paying interest. And so I want to make it something reasonable, but I've reviewed some that are so complicated and we're reviewing that report. We're citing 6 other reports that were done over the last 10 years. We're citing standards and specifications on certain things that are very specific, and it's very difficult. Most of them are pretty easy. Some of them are very difficult, but you could generate an interim that gave a partial review, even though you have some questions, and say, address these, and then we'll give you some feedback on the others, but these need to be addressed. So there's ways you could at least meet that time frame, even if you still had some lingering questions. I think it's reasonable to set a time and then, not have it too short, but I don't think you can extend it too long either.
45 days from when? From filing the appeal, from rejection of
Probably
the.
from a
Yeah,
computer.
that's not appeal. This is different. This is just a review of a sensitive
submittal.
lands.
So when they submit it, we have 45 days.
We
So it's like
typically say submittal and payment. complete.
Well, let's try to be consistent with the other language and see how,
We'll bring
what
that
that
language
is,
back.
but the idea of having that back and forth too would be good. to
And
have
I
in
think the building code one is business days. We can confirm
there. Yeah,
that.
business
but,
days is
um,
good too.
That's
Yeah,
better.
We'll bring that back to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we will
I'll make
complete.
a motion, we adjourn.
Second.
Andy and Sam are.
We've
down.
heard a motion and a second. All in
And Tim
favor of
probably.
adjourning the
Aye.
work meeting, say
Aye.
aye. All right,
Uh,
I'm
adjourned.
just trying to get in there in case there's people